All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. We got most of our participants here. So just quick recap. We've been looking in detail. We started in West Africa. We started in Africa. We focused in on some of the great civilizations of West Africa. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. We got most of our participants here. So sorry about that. So again, started in West Africa. We looked at the development of West African civilization. We looked at some of the great West African nations that existed. And then we looked at their rise and downfall and how that interacted with some other events going on in the world, particularly the European age exploration, and also the expansion of Islam across Central Africa into West Africa, and then also into Southern Europe. So all these events from 500 CE into the 1400 CE really all play a significant role in inciting what becomes known as the transatlantic slave trade. So here you see this map, this diagram showing you how the transatlantic slave trade actually operated. You have manufactured products coming back out of the Americas, heading to Britain and to other European countries, manufactured products like grain, iron, tobacco, iron, rice, indigo, deer skins, fish, furs, whale products, all going back to the UK or Britain as it was known then. And then they're selling cheap manufactured products, including firearms, to Africans. In exchange, Africans are supplying the market with slaves, which are being taken to the Americas, and the Americas are then providing those raw materials back to the European colonies. And that is your so-called triangular trade that we had covered. And then we looked at the origins of where a lot of those Africans coming into North America were imported from. We talked about the Protestant Reformation, the rise of Great Britain, some of the early colonies. We talked about some of the struggles with the Jamestown colony and how eventually, after a struggle in Jamestown or in the Virginia colony, a struggle there, particularly known as Bacon's Rebellion, changes the relationship between white elites and the poor whites, and then our white, what we would call indentured servants and their offspring. And then also it changed the relationship between whites in general and Black indentured servants, who are now going to be looked at more so as slaves. And we start seeing some of the origins of America's versions of institutionalized racism. All right. We talked about the emergence of chattel slavery as a result of Bacon's Rebellion, at least in Virginia. The official establishment of slavery, Virginia, talked about slave codes, the Barbados connection, and the relationship between slavery in the United States and slavery in the Caribbean. We talked about staple crops and their relationship with slavery, and this really speaks to the connection between the institution of capitalism and, in its early forms, mercantilism, and the development of slave societies in the Americas. And then we talked about plantation culture, right? I think this is where we left off. Uh-oh, sorry about that. So again, we talked about the diversity of plantation cultures. Some plantations enormous, but most were small, self-contained. You have about 3/4 of all Blacks who were in colonial slavery living on plantations with about 10 people at minimum, while about 50% maybe with 50 or so people at minimum. Marriage not encouraged. Slave Africans did attempt to construct strong families, but remember, one of the greatest threats, probably what was the most significant threat to maintain order on plantations, was the threat of breaking up families. That is, people, you could threaten to kill people, you could threaten to beat, restrain gifts, anything, or restrain privileges, but it was a threat that your child or your mother or your sister or brother could be separated from you. So African people had to make all kinds of concessions with the slave system or the institution so that they could keep their families together. And that was an ongoing struggle. And sometimes their concessions even that they made and sacrificing their own dignity in many cases still couldn't keep their families unified. And we'll look at that theme of that attempt to keep families together, and that struggle is how it was one of the main ways that African people were manipulated and forced to capitulation. All right, we already covered a lot of this stuff. We covered this. We talked about Bencher Smith. And then we also talked about over time, you start to see a decrease in the amount of African-born slaves in the American colonies. Here's Charles. This is yeah.
Your slides are not updating. Okay.
Sorry about that. Thank you. All right, so now we can move on to the section we were on. So I was just recapping anyway. Y'all had seen most of those slides already. So colonial slavery in America, slavery's early presence. So remember, we talked about this already. First, African Americans that arrive in Jamestown are brought as servants, not necessarily as slaves. But you do get a small number of slaves in the Southern colonies in the early years. However, at this time, indentured servants were still cheaper and more readily available. However, after 1660, white servants are becoming harder to obtain. The English economy is improving, likely a result of their investments into the colonial system. As their economy is improving, not as many people are willing to make that journey to the New World and put themselves into indentured service contracts. So enslaved Africans became seen as a better long-term investment. You could easily identify them. You could make laws that easily restricted that particular group of people. And then also, they were unfamiliar with the terrain. So that made them a better option than the local natives if you captured them. They're not going to be familiar with the terrain. They're going to be completely out of their element. And at the same time, it's work that many African people were familiar with, work that they had experience with on the coast of Western Africa, or in the areas of Western Africa. So they become seen as the identifiable best case labor force for the New World labor. But nonetheless, that didn't stop African people from resisting. You would always have multiple situations where African people were fighting back, trying to challenge the system. While situations like this Stonewall Rebellion were regular, this was not the most frequent form of resistance. People found all kinds of ways to try to disrupt the system. And over time, the aggregate of all those actions eventually would influence the conditions that led to the end of slavery in the United States. So slavery in America relied ultimately on physical punishment, or physical control. Black men and women often responded by resisting this physical oppression. This included things like gold bricking, which was this way of shrinking your assigned work. You could sabotage your way, you could sabotage, escape, or you could have an outright rebellion. So we know stories of people trying to escape. Sabotage is where, you would just say, I don't know how this happened. The entire barn caught on fire. All the crops are burned. Oops, my bad. People thought of all ways, and they came with severe consequences at time, but people use whatever the best means for them to disrupt the system. And a lot, manipulation at times was often used, but whatever people could do to minimize their oppression. And it wasn't always successful, but again, the aggregate of it, just any resistance in aggregate started to weigh on the system itself. Sorry. So in September 1730, about 300 enslaved Africans tried to escape through the Great Dismal Swamp. However, the plantation owners hired Native Americans to track them, killed the rebels, and hung 29 of them. But nonetheless, despite being closely monitored, African people continually tried to escape or resist. It was never something that people just completely surrendered to, but also escape or resisting came at great risk. So Stono Rebellion, this is just a brief overview, and we'll look at a lot of situations like this. This is in Charleston, 1739. You have a revolt at the Stono Bridge. It's led by a slave. Either his name was Jimmy or Tommy. It changes depending on what account you're looking at. You have about 20 slaves, or enslaved Africans, are going to break into a weapons storage facility. They killed the men guarding the warehouse, left their severed heads on the building steps, and fled towards Florida. Other enslaved Africans joined them until their numbers reached around 100. These types of plantation raids that they made killed about 30 more people. They stopped to celebrate their victories and beat the djembe drum to attract other people to the area. Slavers on horseback, aided by Native American mercenaries, killed 44 and dispersed the rest. Many of the rebels, including their leader, remained at large for around 3 years. Nonetheless, in 1740, authorities arrested about 150 more people, and they hung 10 daily. All right, so again, the consequences of rebellion or fighting back were very severe. So, a lot of times when we think about it from our privileged perspective here in the future, we look back and say, man, I wouldn't have went for that. I think in the last class, people said, I would have did this, I would have did that. I wouldn't have allowed it to happen. But when you put the consequences into perspective, I'm wondering, does that change your position? So scenario is, if we are all together, this group of us here, we're enslaved, and I say to you, okay, this is what we're gonna do, y'all. We're gonna meet tomorrow night, and we're gonna go kill everybody in the house, and then we're gonna go on the run and see how far we make it. Now, keep in mind, we have no idea really where we're going. We don't know what kind of obstacles we're gonna face on the way there. The only thing is we're just gonna take a chance. Is it worth it if you know that in that instance, you can have food, shelter, and if you complete your assignments, you're unlikely to get severely punished? Where do y'all stand on that? Are y'all willing to take that risk of rebelling?
Times were hard. People was, I guess they wasn't satisfied with the situation, so I guess they did whatever they could to get away from their present situation. So I think it all even out because they say, well, I'd rather die than be a slave.
Fair enough. So I'm asking you, sir, and the rest of you all to put yourselves in their shoes. What would you do?
I guess whatever it takes to survive.
Now, sir, I imagine you have a family, you have children. Yeah, you have. What would you put them at risk because you wanted to escape? Looking at the potential consequences, you see what these people did. They took 150 random people and start hanging them 10 daily for an event that they may or may not have had anything to do with.
Yes, I understand that, but
it's still worth the risk.
Obviously, because they kept doing it. It was just some Africans they weren't able to break. Kunta Kinte.
Got you. Yes.
Toby, your name Toby. But you see, they couldn't break him. They never broke him. So, I mean, people are going to have the urge to be free.
All right. Anybody else comments on that?
I agree with him. I'll take the risk. If I know my kids could be free and I go through what I gotta go through, I'll do it.
Yeah.
What about your mother? Would you risk her
My
life?
mother?
Yeah, your mother's on the plantation. Would you risk her life? You going to fight knowing that it could come back on your mom and your brother and people of that nature. Is it still worth the risk?
If they grown just like me. If they make the choice to do it, then hey.
And they made the choice to say, you know what? Our situation
all
is bad.
together.
our situation is bad, but I'm trying to survive. I don't want to die. And you're saying I'd rather die. Do you, in taking your actions, are you willing to put them at risk? And it's no right or wrong answer here. It's just something to think about.
I mean, I'd rather fight and then not just sit here and just take what they giving me. I'd rather sit here and fight for my freedom and not sit here and just be like, yeah, y'all can beat me and kill me and slaughter me like we in a slaughterhouse.
Yeah, they're gonna do that anyway once they catch your ass.
I mean, I'd rather fight than,
So you said they're gonna do it anyway once they catch you. So you say you're not resisting?
Yeah, I will resist it, but you gotta look at it. They the one with the power at that particular time.
All right, so let me ask you another question.
Yeah, I would try to be free, but the bad thing about it is if you're trying to go be free, you got to know which direction you're going, because you don't want to be trying to go somewhere else and it's worse than where you just came from.
Fair enough. So tell me this: is it acceptable to kill people in this situation?
Of me trying to be free?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would. So
everybody agree
because this conversation is crazy because I don't know. Antebellum is a good movie for everyone to watch. It's surrounded by like slavery, but I don't want to tell the movie.
Yeah, so please don't, because I still want to see it.
Watch it, please watch it. And when you watch it, that's something we can talk about. I really do want to talk about that though. So
okay, I want to see how historically relevant it is also. But back to the
point.
What's
the name of the movie?
Antebellum.
Antebellum. I ain't hear it.
Now tell me, y'all, is it because I'm gonna keep asking y'all this question as we have these discussions. Are these acceptable murders? Because I know sometimes people get scared. You can't go and kill people. Killing is wrong.
Yeah, killing is wrong either way, but hell, they didn't kill a lot of our ancestors, so I'm gonna kill them to get where I need to get. Period.
So they killed 44 white. They killed. Let me see. I'm sorry. They killed about 30 white people on different plantations trying to free people. And you're saying
what about self-defense?
Is
it self-defense? It's self-defense?
No.
That's what I would call it.
Why would you say no? It's not self-defense.
The reason why I said because back then it just wasn't self-defense. Back then it is whatever the white folks said it was. There ain't no self-defense. You gonna die either way. You kill one of their people.
But I guess what he's arguing is that slavery itself is an act of violence against Black people. So Black people resisting slavery, he's saying in their defense of themselves and their families, they have the right to kill or be killed.
You're right.
1 second.
Oh, you finna get on them churn ass. No, I'm playing.
Y'all hilarious. They screaming in the background.
All right. So we all agree. All right. All right. Let's go to the next one. All right. So African people tended to escape in groups of individuals who shared a common homeland or language. They would normally stay near where their plantation estates were, and they would steal supplies as necessary. In some cases, they escaped west, where they sometimes will find refuge with different Native American groups. In other situations, they might make their own settlements in inaccessible areas. This was very popular in the Caribbean, particularly in Jamaica, but it also happened in the United States. And we refer to these groups as Maroons. These were runaways who formed communities in isolated areas and would try to survive there for as long as they can without being discovered by whites. And they were very successful at doing this for some time, different maroon communities, with some popular maroon communities here in North Florida, particularly living around a place called Fort Mose, which we'll get to that momentarily. So So again, most durable maroon community existed in the Spanish colony of Florida. 1693, the Spanish king makes the colony an actual refuge for slaves, as long as they had escaped from British colonies. But this didn't apply to the slaves he had. It was just kind of a way to be a thorn in the side of the British because they had that intense rivalry going on. So a lot of those who escaped from Georgia and surrounding areas, once they got to Florida, they would join the Seminole Nation, and thereby they gained their protection. And this is one of the major causes of the First Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. All right, so let's shift gears to some other colonial developments. Benjamin Banneker. I'm sorry, say that again.
I had a question.
Please.
So when the slaves from Georgia went to Florida, did they have to have like documents saying that they came from British colonial so they could be free in Florida?
No, they didn't have to have documents. Or I'm not aware of any situation where they had to produce evidence. It kind of was just taken on where they were coming from, what language they spoke.
Oh, okay.
All right. So Benjamin Banneker is an interesting individual. He's born in Maryland in the 1700s. His father and grandfather were both former slaves. He was a farmer. 1753, he bought a pocket watch from one of his neighbors, took it apart, made a drawing of each component, and then he would reassemble this watch, returning it fully functioning to its owner, and then proceeded to carve out of wood in large replicas of each part. All right. So I know you're saying, y'all know who Benjamin Banneker is? Y'all heard of him?
Yes.
Okay, good. Age 58, he started to study astronomy, and he was soon able to predict future solar and lunar eclipses. He created an information table for annual almanacs, and it would be published in 1792 and 1797, referred to as Benjamin Banneker's Almanac. It was a top seller throughout Pennsylvania, all the way to Virginia, and even sold copies in Kentucky. 1791, he was working as a technical assistant in the first ever surveying of Washington, D.C., referred to often as the Sable astronomer. He was seen as evidence that African Americans were not intellectually inferior. Thomas Jefferson even noted this in a letter that he wrote to Benjamin Banneker. All right, so very briefly, to understand how we go from colonial America into the so-called American Revolution, I had to kind of step away from our strict coverage of African American events and kind of put it in perspective of what's happening in the larger world. So in 1688, you have the so-called Glorious Revolution, and the British Parliament asserts its authority there, right? So this puts Britain on course to become one of the most powerful empires in the world. And this is also a result of their mercantilist theory. Now, this is an economic philosophy, or the way they operated their colonial economies. This will lead to the passage of the Navigation Acts, this mercantilist theory. Now, the Navigation Acts were different laws that the British Parliament put in place that allowed them to control all goods coming out of their colonies. It required all goods to be shipped to England or to English colonies, and to be shipped on English ships. So they were cutting out their competition. They were extracting all the resources from their colonies, and they were growing wealthy in their home country as a result. Most colonial products, sugar, tobacco, cotton, had to be first sent to England before they could be shipped anywhere else. This stopped the colonists from making money on the side by selling money directly to other colonies. So if you were in Virginia and you had a connect in France who needed tobacco, you could sell it there, but the British put an end to this with the enforcement of these navigation acts. So according to mercantilist doctrine, the mother country was to produce finished products and the colonies would produce raw material. And the raw materials were being produced by slave labor, making it a very cheap labor market, and the British were making a fortune off of it. So as a result, at the end of the 17th century, none of the colonies except Boston had really urbanized. But you go by 1720, Boston has 12,000, New York has 7,000 residents, Charleston has nearly 4,000. In another 40-year period, you have even more semi-urban centers emerging. Salem, Hartford, Baltimore, and Savannah, as well as Norfolk, all started to have significant development. By the eve of the Revolution, Philadelphia has about 30,000 residents, while New York had 25,000 and Boston has 16,000. Each city had its affluent elite class, as well as a growing underclass of impoverished individuals, likely the descendants of those previous indentured servants. But nonetheless, what you see is significant development in the colonies, which is separating them from their British origins, making them uniquely different culturally and politically. Now, also what's going to stimulate the cultural change in the colonies, and we're really talking amongst whites here, popular was the so-called Great Awakening, which was a growing demand for better churches with the application of Enlightenment thinking. So George Whitefield, an English preacher, he comes to Philadelphia in 1739 with this new and enthusiastic religious message that got a lot of people excited. He drew crowds in the thousands wherever he spoke on a 15-month tour. His message appeared to the poor, old, young, male, female, and even slaves. And the secret to his success was to walk a thin line where he would challenge authority when he was talking to lower class or oppressed people. And then when he was talking to authority, he would support them at the same time. So he just would say whatever people wanted to hear and everybody liked it. So a lot of his influence led to several slaves being converted to Christianity. Now, he condemned slavery, but not the ownership, as long as Africans were treated well and converted. He also incorporated some African traditions, such as shouting and ecstatic visions, speaking in tongues, into his religious practices as a way to incorporate Africans into the process. Now, early in the enslavement experience, Africans have retained their traditional religions, but following the Great Awakening, it became more acceptable to Christianize Africans. Charles Colcock Jones published The Religious Instruction of the Negroes. And this was basically a text where he comes up with he presents several strategies for implementing programs of religious instruction for slaves. He made recommendations of having Sabbath services as well as weekday plantation meetings. He says basically in a quote, "The Christian gospel must be presented in a way that is intelligible to the uneducated African slave and must be inculcated early in childhood when possible. The guiding principle he describes for dealing with the condition of the slave is to be only concerned with the spiritual, not the secular, political, or civil." Right? So he wants to create a scenario, and he's saying this is the best way to do it, is to convince African people, or Black people in America and the slaves, that they have nothing to worry about on earth, is because after they work and they die, then they'll receive all their blessings when they get to heaven. Thoughts on this?
That's some bull.
What's bull about it?
Well, they're using the same thing, the Bible, to justify slavery, but they want to indoctrinate the enslavement with that particular, doctrine. I don't understand it.
Not only are they using the Bible to justify slavery, they're using the Bible to reinforce white supremacy in slavery. by having Black people internalize a concept that not only God is white and that because they're Black, they're inferior, but more so than that, they're teaching them that their salvation comes after they die, meaning that their lives on earth are meaningless and they could waste it away in slavery and it wouldn't be of much consequence. So it's a great brainwashing taking place here, and Christianity is being used as the crux to have it done, or have this mental conditioning completed. Thoughts here? Does this suggest that Christianity is a negative element in African culture or African American culture?
Yeah, because it was used against them. What about their traditional religions? Did any of the enslaved people maintain that?
To the best of their ability. And they had more success with this in the Caribbean and South America when they were able to infuse those religious practices into their Catholic or religious faith in many cases. But in the Americas, you had a more culturally rigid system that really pushed and outlawed African traditions. So it was very rare that people held on to it. And then in many cases, the teachings of Christianity demonized African spiritual practices. So even when we had the discussion earlier in class and I asked, were you familiar with any African deities? Or I asked, were you familiar with any African spiritual practices? And some came up, people were like, oh, that's evil. You know what I mean? So it's just how people have been taught to look at their own traditions as demonic. And that could be problematic when you're trying to culturally and mentally or psychologically liberate a people and they think of their own people as demonic or evil.
Well, was that not part of the strategy when they used the Bible of teaching them stuff that wasn't really in the Bible? They just wrote it for themselves.
Very much possibly that was the intended strategy. Cultural, I believe it's called acculturation or menticide, that's what some Black psychologists will call it. The eradication of a group's culture preceding a genocide of the people.
And the British has perfected it. And exported it to the United States.
So in the latter part of the 17th century and into the early 18th century, France and England had come to dominate North America. Both have made several steps towards developing prosperous empires that span across the planet at this point. After long periods of instability, at the beginning of the 18th century, Britain's North American colonies had started to develop some pretty significant societies that would maintain in that same fashion until the American Revolution. However, despite their size and their success and their growth, mercantilism was still the rule of the day. The British were still enforcing those navigation acts. Their only rival in North America was France, which was the bitter enemy. They had had tribal warfare between the French and the British for quite some time. They'd had a series of land disputes in their American colonies, which would lead to an expensive tribal war known as the French Indian War. It was started by Virginian colonists. Basically, George Washington was one of the people who started this conflict. The French had sent messengers to negotiate with the British, and Washington opened fire on them. So then when the French found out about it, they were going to come destroy Virginia, and George Washington had to call for support of the British. All right. So England had to spend enormous sums of money to achieve victory as this grew into a full-scale conflict between two major powerful nations. England had to spend a lot of money. So at the end of it, they were like, why did we get into this fight? Virginia pulls us into a fight, and then we have to pay for it. So how are we going to make them pay their fair share? Now, also, let's look at this, how European scholars viewed Africans. Here is the great philosopher David Hume, one of the cornerstones of contemporary American and Western philosophy. I am apt to suspect the Negro to be naturally inferior to whites. There scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturers amongst them, no arts, no sciences. Fact, fiction, is he right?
That's a lie that's still being propagated today.
But there's a bigger problem with this. I want somebody to go on Google and type in David Hume and see what he's thought of as. Just a quick summary. Tell me what you find.
Is this the same guy that was with the World Today, World Tomorrow, David Hume?
Look it up real quick. What y'all got? Man, y'all slow. Hurry up. Are y'all serious, man?
You said David Humes, right?